Hi there. Welcome to Systematic Investigative Routines for Suspicion of a Disability in a Multilingual Learner. This session will provide information about what teams may want to consider when they aren't sure whether or not to suspect a disability in a student who speaks another language. My name is Angie Neal. I'm the Speech Language Pathology Consultant and Policy Advisor for Speech Language Services and Early Literacy in the Office of Special Education Services at the South Carolina State Department of Education. The agenda and purpose for today's webinar is to provide clarity and consistency as it relates to suspicion of a disability in multilingual learners, to outline key questions to be asked and data that might need to be gathered, and to clarify the requirements of IDEA related to suspicion of a disability. On this slide, you will see the top 10 primary home languages that are spoken in South Carolina. This is as of February of 2024. The underlined links in blue are links that will tell you more about each of the different languages, or in the case of Spanish, the different dialectical variations of Spanish. These are great resources when looking to see whether or not the student has been taught the differences between their home language and General American English. The first thing to appreciate relative to multilingual learners and suspicion of a disability is that when there is suspicion of a disability, access to appropriate evaluations for determination of a disability may not be delayed or denied relative to screening, as the LEA must do everything in its power to ensure that hearing and vision screenings are completed in a timely manner, even going so far as to schedule appointments and/or transportation when necessary. It also may not be delayed or denied due to intervention. There's no requirement for a student to complete interventions when there is a suspicion of a disability. More on that in a moment. Also, evaluations cannot be delayed or denied due to English language proficiency. In other words, there is no requirement that the student must have some level of English proficiency prior to an evaluation. The link you see embedded there are the letters from the Office of Special Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education, who has issued this guidance twice, in 2011 and again recently in 2023. It's also important to keep in mind IDEA's requirement for rule-out factors that need to be considered as well. In making a determination of eligibility, a child shall not be determined as a child with a disability if the determinant factor is a lack of appropriate instruction in reading. This includes the essential components of reading instruction. That includes specifically systematic and explicit instruction in phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. In other words, the team has to make sure that the student has been provided those things prior to determination of a disability. The same goes for a lack of instruction in math and, as we see here again, limited English proficiency. We cannot say a student has a disability simply because they have not fully acquired English. The requirement to address a lack of appropriate instruction in reading mirrors that of the ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. This is the general education law that is specific to how comprehensive literacy instruction must be provided. It states that comprehensive literacy instruction means age-appropriate, explicit, systematic, and intentional instruction in phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, language structures, which includes morphology and syntax, which we'll talk about in a moment as that relates specifically to multilingual learners, as well as fluency and comprehension. Another IDEA requirement as it relates to limited English proficiency to keep in mind when you suspect a disability is that any assessment that is given to a multilingual learner, it has to be selected and administered so as to not be discriminatory on either a racial or cultural basis. We also have to make sure that any assessments are provided and administered in the child's native language or other mode of communication and in the form most likely to yield accurate information on what the child knows, what they can do academically, developmentally, and functionally, unless it is clearly not feasible to provide or administer in that child's native language. And we have to make sure that these assessments are administered by trained and knowledgeable personnel. Now let's get into some of the investigative routines by thinking about data to gather prior to making a referral to the database problem-solving team. One of the first things to consider is whether or not the ILAP instructional recommendations are they adequately supporting the student's needs. This needs to come from the teacher to talk with the multilingual teacher about. And if the instructional recommendations are not adequately supporting the student's needs, then the teacher needs to work with the multilingual teacher to then tweak them as appropriate. This is where we start to get into a discussion about making sure that these linguistic differences between the student's primary language and General American English have been shared. And by linguistic differences, I mean, what is the difference between the child's primary language and the language phonology, morphology, and syntax, and oftentimes the vocabulary and sometimes even the pragmatic skills. And how is that different from the phonology, morphology, syntax, vocabulary, and pragmatic expectations of General American English? So we have to make sure that those specific things have been taught and that those specific things have been shared across all educational settings, so all educators that the student works with. And when providing this information to the student, appreciating that they're going to need additional time and instruction to learn these linguistic differences. Because if you think about it, students who speak General American English, when they're learning how to read, they only have to learn the mapping. What do the sounds look like? What does this sentence look like in print? However, when a student is coming to school speaking something other than General American English, now they're learning a new oral language variety and also learning how to map that new oral language variety into print. Here are just a few examples of how languages differ. So for example, the phonology of English, the sound system, the sound patterns of sounds and how sounds can be arranged in English. Well, in English, 85% of words end in a consonant, with almost 30% of them ending in a consonant cluster. However, there are at least 8 to 10 common languages or dialects that do not sequence two consonants together, so no consonant clusters. Another difference in phonology is that there's 8 to 10 common languages or dialects that do not include the voiced and voiceless TH phonemes, so the th as in think or th as in that. So we have to make sure those are specifically taught so that they can then learn what they look like as represented by the letters T and H when they see them in print. Morphology, there's at least 5 common languages where plurals are marked using a number instead of using a plural S as we do in General American English. So for example, in another language, it would be translated as there are 2 cat instead of there are 2 cats. In terms of syntax, in English, there's roughly 4 to 5 distinct verb forms, though in Spanish, there can be between 46 to 47 different verb forms. So this is going to have a tremendous difference in terms of how words are put together to form sentences. In terms of semantics or vocabulary, in just English dialects, you can appreciate that there are different words used to communicate the same meaning, especially as you think about Coke as opposed to pop or soda. Same thing with use versus y'all, or jumper using the term jumper as they do in British English as opposed to the term sweater. In terms of pragmatics, you're really thinking about cultural differences. So for example, greetings may differ a great deal across cultures. Some cultures wave, some cultures hug or kiss each other on the cheek, or they shake hands, or they bow, or sometimes they even use a question inflection. In terms of narrative skills or the ability to tell or retell a story, those can differ in terms of the internal response of one of the characters, the markers of the discourse, as well as acting as either the listener or the participant. These can be very specific to cultures. What I hope you take away from this is that no language or form of language is in error. These are differences. And we don't want to extinguish these differences. We want to point out the differences and also to make sure that the student has learned these differences. This slide actually is sharing with you a white paper from AIM Institute that recently came out, and it talks about 5 marginal shifts for English learners in any classrooms. And one of the first big shifts that they talk about, actually the first and second shift, is really talking about those components of language that I just illustrated. The phonology, the morphology, the semantics, the syntax, and then also pointing out the differences in the phonemes of the sounds of the language. So I hope you will follow that link to that white paper and find out more. Getting back again in the thinking about what to do prior to even making a referral to the problem-solving team, the teacher needs to also ask if the ILAP accommodations are adequately supporting the student's needs. If those accommodations are not adequately supporting the student, then the teacher and the multilingual teacher need to work together to tweak it to be appropriate. We also need to think about how the student is responding to the accommodations, and are they bridging those linguistic or language gaps enough to support learning. And again, prior to referral, it's going to be important to document this. Document how do we know whether or not these accommodations are bridging the linguistic gaps and supporting the student's learning. Still thinking prior to referral, we also need to have the teacher ask, is the student receiving other interventions or other supports? So for example, are they on a 504? Are they getting any other interventions? And if that is happening, then that data needs to be gathered as part of the problem-solving process. Now, as a point of very critical clarification, especially as it relates to that term intervention, it's important to know that multilingual instruction is not an intervention. It is part of the general education program. So again, multilingual instruction is not an intervention. Another thing to know is that kindergarten students can receive multilingual instruction, and multilingual students can receive both support in reading and multilingual support. So they can attend both types of support programs, reading interventions and multilingual instruction. Now let's talk about some of the investigative routines to consider as part of or once the student is brought to the problem-solving team. The first thing to appreciate is who needs to be at the table when you're talking about a multilingual learner and the problem-solving team. That problem-solving team, of course, needs to include the teacher, as well as a special education teacher, a school psychologist, of course, the student's multilingual teacher, a speech-language pathologist, a translator, an administrator or LEA, and most importantly, and this is sometimes different for other problem-solving teams, but it's very important to include the parent. Let me explain why. Parent input is critical when considering the suspicion of a disability in a multilingual learner. According to the Office of Civil Rights and the South Carolina Family Engagement K-12 framework, parents must be invited to participate in the problem-solving team. Another thing to appreciate about when we're inviting parents to participate is that those forms that are used as part of the problem-solving process must be translated into the parent or the family or a caregiver's primary language, and that we could use or translators could be utilized to support the completion of these forms before they get to the problem-solving meeting. And translators must be provided as needed or as requested by the parent, because parents provide critical data for the problem-solving team to consider. We'll go over those next. Some of the helpful data that is provided by parents is a review of the child's educational history. So for example, did the student go attend school? How long did they go to school? In their country of origin? Because not all countries require that children go to school K through 12. Or even that all students, male or female, attend. In some countries, the males get to attend school longer than females. We also need to find out more about if there were any indications of struggles at any of the schools previously attended. We also need an idea of the child's developmental history. And if the parents have concerns about the child's development, what do the parents report about development of their child in comparison to their siblings or cousins or other children who, again, speak that same language? Also, information about mental health. And for pre-K children, information about pre-academic skills in the native language. So for example, use of vocabulary to label shapes or colors or count, as well as their ability to make their needs known and those self-help skills. In terms of exposure to and opportunities for instruction and or poverty, we need to consider that if there are questions about whether or not the child may have had access to things like books or scissors or other pre-academic materials and experiences, the team can provide dynamic assessment, and that dynamic assessment will provide that critical data that will help rule out whether or not the student is struggling due to exposure or opportunity, as opposed to the ability to complete those types of tasks. So for example, if the parents report that the student had not held a book or scissors before, then the team can provide that item to the student, explain how to use it, give them a turn to demonstrate the skill or ask for clarification. And this may be completed in just a few seconds or even immediately. But the whole idea is to determine how much scaffolding or supports the student will need to conduct these basic types of tasks with just a little bit of instruction. Because typically developing children will pick up new skills with relative ease. Children who may have some underlying challenges will need significant scaffolding, multiple cues, or even reteaching, despite having been taught that skill at least once or twice. Now let's discuss some of the screening data. First, let's discuss permission to screen. So what to appreciate about screening according to IDEA is that screening for instructional purposes is not considered an evaluation. So the screening of a student by a teacher or specialist to determine appropriate instructional strategies, so strategies to be implemented within the general education curriculum, that's not considered to be an evaluation for eligibility. In other words, screenings, an actual screening tool, use of a screening tool, you can use that to support the development of instructional supports or instructional strategies. But screenings alone do not determine eligibility. And they also may not determine who may or may not receive an evaluation. So for example, a screening, for example, by a speech-language pathologist, there cannot be a quote-unquote pass-fail because that could be considered determining eligibility because it's not allowing the student to go forward, or it's already determining whether or not there's a presence of a disability. Instead, observations need to be made and the entire team needs to discuss the data that is gathered and make that determination about whether to go forward with an evaluation and the components of that evaluation as a team. So again, observation is not a screening. Observation by the data-driven problem-solving team, this is important because observation can give information to the team about the student's stage of language acquisition, which I'll explain more. It can also help reveal the helpfulness of the accommodations, as we just spoke about. We can also use observations to look at the student in comparison to other multilingual learners, and we can observe the student and their work samples and use that to compare to other multilingual learners. Two very helpful tools to help gather data from parents are the Alberta Language Questionnaire and the Alberta Language Environment Questionnaire. Now, these are both free and online. Now, let me explain the different purposes of both. So the Alberta Language Questionnaire, this tool gathers data related to the child's developmental milestones, their early language skills, behaviors and activity preferences, family history of language and learning disabilities, and all using norm referencing. The Alberta Language Environment Questionnaire, this tool gathers data relative to language use at home among family members, how long the student has been exposed or if they've been exposed to a second language, as well as the parent's level of fluency in the second language, all of which is critically important data when considering suspicion of a disability and, if necessary, planning for an evaluation. Let's talk about the stages of language acquisition. When thinking about a suspected disability, it's important to keep in mind the different stages of language acquisition. In the early stages, referred to as the silent or pre-production stages, this occurs within 0 to 3 months of being exposed to another language. Some of the linguistic behaviors that might be observed that would indicate that this student is at the silent or pre-production level is going to be things like their responses in the second language are going to be more gestural or nonverbal as opposed to verbal. Their attempts to communicate with speakers of English or L2, those are also going to be more gestural or nonverbal. Their comprehension may be at about just around 500 words, and they may use some new words from time to time in the new L2 or second language, which includes using some words of English, but they're also demonstrating active listening for instructions, active listening to the communication that's around them. In stage 2, this is referred to as early pre-production. And early pre-production typically occurs between 3 to 6 months of just being exposed to the new language or the L2 language. So some of those behaviors include, now they're comprehending closer to 500 to 1,000 words. They may use some communication in English. They may even use some phrases. But those phrases in English are typically going to be very short, about 1 to 3 words in length. They're able to answer yes or no, who and what types of questions, again using very short answers. They may use very familiar or repetitive phrases that they hear over and over again. And they tend to use English the majority of the time just in the present tense, not in the past or future tense. In the third stage of language acquisition, this is referred to as speech emergence or telegraphic and formulaic speech. Now, stage 3 occurs between 6 months and 2 years of second language exposure. So this covers a broad window. This is where the student is getting immersed and learning more and more of the second language. And some of those linguistic behaviors appear as this. They comprehend approximately 3,000 words. So we're seeing a huge jump in that vocabulary knowledge of the second language. They're able to ask simple questions and speak in simple sentences. These tend to be closer to 3 to 4 words in length. Now they're using conjunctions, pronouns, demonstratives, and prepositions that are in General American English, even if they weren't present in the student's primary language. They're also still going to be demonstrating some of those grammatical differences that are consistent with their primary language or L1. So for example, like I gave the example earlier with morphology, they may still mark the plural with the number as opposed to that plural S. They're able to participate in small group activities. They may struggle with some humor as well as abstract or figurative language, meaning they take things very concretely. And they're able to demonstrate that they understand the auditory comprehension, the verbal, the listening comprehension. They're able to demonstrate that in a variety of ways. At the fourth stage of language acquisition, that's referred to as intermediate fluency. This is within 2 to 3 years of being exposed to a second language. Now those behaviors may look like comprehension of around 6,000 words. Now their sentence production includes some more complex sentence types. At this point, they begin asking for clarification and giving opinions in English. There's a lot less grammatical differences that are specifically attributed to their primary language. They're able to start acquiring more information from what they read in textbooks. And they still may struggle a little bit with abstract content or subject areas that require high degree of background knowledge, or that there's a high level of complex syntax in what they're reading. And finally, we get to stage 5, which is advanced language proficiency. And this is sometime around 3 or more years of exposure to a second language. And at this point in time, this is where we would see a student who is able to fully participate in the educational setting. Their speech includes a variety of general American English sentence types. There are very few grammatical differences, and their social and their interpersonal language is very similar to that of a student who's always spoken English. But please note and keep in mind that the academic language, so the language and vocabulary that is above and beyond your basic language skills. So this is reflecting, we're thinking more about advanced vocabulary terms, advanced levels of thinking and reasoning. That still does not develop until about 5 to 7 years beyond just that advanced language proficiency. So these are things to keep in mind so that we can have sort of a gauge to understand what we should expect of the student when they're referred for suspicion of a disability. Now let's talk about some of the things that may come across or need to be reviewed as part of the multilingual program. So the multilingual teacher is going to provide some significant data and observations that will really help the team systematically investigate suspicion of the disability. So for example, the multilingual teacher should be able to provide information about, is the student performing commensurate with the stage of language acquisition based on the length of time they've been exposed to the L2 or to English. So again, that's why that time frame was important to include those other slides. The multilingual teacher is also going to give us observational input about how does this student compare in terms of acquiring new knowledge in comparison to similar multilingual students. The multilingual teacher is also going to be able to review with the problem-solving team the ILAP data and report on things such as how has the student progressed towards the goals in the ILAP, and based on whatever the concerns are that's brought to the problem-solving team, is there a need to revisit the ILAP goals? Same thing with the accommodations, and based on the concerns, is there a need to revisit the ILAP accommodations? Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because this is something that we ask the teacher to do before they come to the problem-solving team, so that that can be addressed before they come to the problem-solving team. And then if it's been tweaked, now we want to, again, pull in the whole problem-solving team to look at those. The multilingual teacher will also provide data and information about the WIDA. Did the student qualify for multilingual support? Also, access data. What does the student's access scores look like over time? In other words, are they gaining more skills? Also, they can report about if there are significant and unexpected being the key word, discrepancies between speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Specifically, if reading and writing are lower, then we may need the team to revisit the question of whether or not systematic, explicit, and intentional instruction has been provided in the essential components of reading. And reading and listening actually tend to be acquired first. So again, when you're looking at discrepancies, it may be that their scores in reading and listening are higher, but that would not be unexpected. The ML teacher will also provide information about early proficiency levels and what they're based on and what that score looks like, as well as what exit criteria may include. Now let's specifically address how do we determine the difference between a linguistic or language difference, from a disability across several different areas of potential concern. First, let's talk about listening comprehension. So for example, A student may or not respond well to verbal directions. Well, how do we know if it's a language difference or if there might be an underlying disability? Well, it's likely a language difference if the student struggles to understand English vocabulary, but they do understand the words if you provide them in the primary language. However, a disability is more likely suspected if there are consistent difficulties, consistent confusion, no matter whether or not the directions are given in the primary language or the second language. Same thing with student needs frequent repetition of oral directions and input. So it's likely a language difference if the student struggles to understand those verbal directions in the second language or English, but not if you provided that same instruction or direction in their primary language in L1. However, it may be more of an indication of a disability if the student is often forgetting those directions or they need further explanation in both their primary language and their second language or English. And then finally, for listening comprehension, let's say the behavior is that they're experiencing a delay in responding to questions that are asked in the classroom. Well, a delay in responding may be due to mentally translating from English to the student's primary language and then back into L2. That's likely a language difference. However, it's likely a potential disability if the student consistently takes longer to respond in L1 as well as in L2. In terms of spoken language, let's talk about some of those behaviors. Well, what if the student is often exhibiting pauses or hesitations, or if they leave out words? Well, it's likely a language difference if the student doesn't quite have all of the vocabulary, the sentence structure, or even confidence in L2. But it's likely more possible to be a disability or suspicion of a disability if their speech is difficult to understand in both the primary language as well as in the second language or English. Another behavior is if the student is unable to orally retell a story. For example, even what did you do this summer or what did you do this weekend? Well, it's likely a language difference if their struggles are because they don't have the words or the ability to put the syntax together. Again, think back to those stages of language acquisition. Maybe they just haven't acquired that level of proficiency yet. However, it's likely a potential suspicion of a disability if that same student is asked that same question in their L1 and they have just as much difficulty answering those questions or doing those story retells in their L1 as in L2. And then finally, another behavior is what if the student does not respond aloud to questions, or maybe they just don't speak very often? Well, a student who lacks expressive language skills in English, again, this could still be part of where they fall within that stage of language acquisition. They could even be just in that silent period of second language acquisition. However, it is likely suspicion of a disability if they're not responding to questions or if they're not speaking frequently in both languages, both primary language and second language. Now let's talk in terms of phonemic awareness and phonological awareness. This is a critical pre-reading skill, and as we talked about, this is one of those features of comprehensive literacy instruction that has to be provided explicitly, systematically, and intentionally. So let's talk about two behaviors you might see with phonemic and phonological awareness. So one behavior could be the student does not remember those letter sounds that have been taught from one day to the next. Well, it's likely a language difference due to acquiring English if that difficulty remembering that letter sound occurs mostly when they are first learning this new language or General American English, especially those sounds and letters that are not part of their native language or their primary language. So that is why the links that I gave you at the very beginning for the top 10 languages, that's why that information is so critically important to know which sounds or letters are not part of that student's primary language so that we don't automatically assume it's because they don't know them, but maybe they haven't been taught them. Because what you would see with the language difference is that improvement is noted with that instruction and with that practice. However, suspicion of a disability may look more like they're struggling to remember those letter sounds, even if those letter sounds are part of their primary language and English, and if they struggle still to remember them, or there's little improvement after that instruction and practice has been provided. Another factor or another behavior is that difficulty blending letter sounds, that very specific phonological awareness skill of sound blending. Well, in a language difference, letter sound errors may be more related to that primary language again. Again, that primary language may not even have short vowel sounds. But again, what we need to look for is whether or not that phoneme is part of their language and whether or not they improve once we've taught those differences and given them opportunities to practice with feedback. That's a language difference. However, suspicion of a disability, again, it may look like that the student is substituting letters or they're substituting sounds. There's no real rhyme or reason for the different sound and letter substitutions that they put in their writing, or even when they're reading or when they're trying to blend. And this is not going to be related to their primary language. Again, it could be that is a sound that's in their primary language, or their primary language does include blending consonant, vowel, consonant. But they're still struggling to blend them. They're struggling with just the letter sound in isolation. That is more of a suspicion of a disability. Now, what's interesting is multilingual students and phonological awareness. Phonological awareness is a very sensitive indicator because the profiles of poor readers for both language minority and monolingual English speakers are very similar in that both types of poor readers, they're going to have difficulties in both phonological awareness and working memory. Meaning regardless of what language you speak, if you struggle with phonological awareness in Spanish, you're going to likely struggle with phonological awareness in English, as well as working memory. However, students who can process and manipulate the sounds of their first language, they're likely able to do the same thing in a second language or in English. So again, phonological awareness is something we really need to pay close attention to because it is a very sensitive indicator. Now let's talk about word level decoding. Well, that behavior may look like the student is struggling with grade appropriate decoding skills. Well, we need to consider a language difference if those grade level appropriate phonic patterns, those phonic patterns, have they been taught and is improvement noted after that explicit instruction and practice has been provided. However, we would likely suspect a disability if those grade level appropriate patterns have been taught, but we don't see that improvement after that additional explicit instruction and practice with feedback. In terms of reading fluency, we need to be looking at behaviors such as the student struggling to read or reread with grade appropriate text with accuracy expression at a rate appropriate to support comprehension. Now, in terms of linguistic differences, that difference is going to be there when the student is actually translating what they're reading from General American English, because that's what the text is written in, back into their primary language, then back out while they're reading. That's a lot of task to do, so that is going to definitely impact their fluency. However, we would likely suspect a disability if they're struggling due to the word decoding deficits, just difficulty decoding the words, as well as language comprehension deficits. So looking specifically at they don't understand the vocabulary. They're struggling with the morphology and the syntax of the sentences. They don't have all of the background knowledge to comprehend the passage, or even those concepts of print and verbal reasoning skills. In terms of reading comprehension, some behaviors you might see is the student is struggling to understand the passage. They can read it and they can decode it, but they're struggling to answer those comprehension questions. Well, let's consider the presence of a language difference if the student doesn't have the adequate background knowledge about the topic that they're reading about in General American English, or the student is not using contextual cues. But you do see that improvement with that additional explicit instruction and practice. So for example, if they're reading a passage about ballet and they don't know anything about ballet, after we build that background knowledge, does their comprehension of that passage about ballet increase? However, we would likely suspect a disability if the student is struggling to remember what they read. Now remember, we talked about that they could read it fluently, okay? But if they're struggling to read it, or excuse me, they're struggling to remember what they read, and it doesn't matter if they read it in their primary language or if they read it in English. If they're struggling to remember what they read and there's no improvement with the additional comprehension instruction and explicit instruction and comprehension in practice, then we likely would suspect a disability. And all of this also looks like just difficulty answering comprehension questions. But in a language difference, we have to consider whether or not they know that word in English, in L2. Also, whether or not they are familiar with that sentence structure in L2. Remember, we just talked about how different the morphology and syntax can be from one language to another. But again, like a dynamic assessment, what you're going to see is if that student improves their comprehension after that instruction and that opportunity to practice, that's likely a language difference. However, we're going to suspect a disability if that difficulty with reading comprehension is seen in both their primary language, also in General American English, whether or not you read it in either of those, and they're still struggling after that explicit instruction. What about writing? Well, let's consider behaviors such as errors made in punctuation and capitalization. Well, again, let's consider a language difference as it relates to if the punctuation and capitalization reflects the features of their primary language and how it looks in their primary language, what that punctuation and capitalization looks like. And again, consider if there's improvement as you provide that instruction and practice. However, suspicion of a disability may circle more back to that instruction has been provided and there's limited improvement. And also, the errors that you see are consistent across both their primary language and their second language. And then finally, let's talk about that grammatically appropriate sentence formation. Again, this was something we talked about as one of those rule-out factors. And that's also grammar is very specific in the new South Carolina ELA standards. There's a whole grammar and conventions matrix that will tell you exactly when certain features should have been taught and mastered. So you can find that easily on the South Carolina State Department of Education website, Grammar and Conventions Matrix. Now, we would suspect a language difference if their written sentence reflects the sentence structure of their primary language. So often what this looks like, as I mentioned with the plural S example, it's going to look like how they would say it in their primary language. So you're going to see those shifts in verb tense, differences in adverbs and adjectives, past tense, plurals. But again, you're going to see improvement with instruction and practice. But with a disability, you're likely not going to see that improvement, and the errors are going to appear to be more random in nature. So they're going to leave out words. They're going to be missing whole entire pieces of punctuation, and the grammar errors don't have anything to do with the primary language. So here's where we're going to talk a little bit about contrastive features. These are forms of language that often do vary across languages or dialects. So these are often in flux. These are very much subject to change and be different across languages and dialects. And what we know is that large-scale normative studies have demonstrated that there are at least 40 distinct features that are different between African American English and General American English. So again, this is why I'm pulling this specific to dialect, because it's not just African American dialect, but you could also speak with a Spanish dialect, but not have Spanish as a primary language. So this is why it's important to think about dialectical features. So what you see here is not an exhaustive list. What I will also say is that there are different lists of non-contrastive features, which we're going to talk about next. And it is not clear in the research as to why, who is included what. So this is really just a general guide. What you see here is specific to African American English, but there are lots of overlaps with Southern English. So this is something to consider when looking at the different languages and dialects. Now, across dialects, these things may contrast. These things may be different. So we may have differences in whether or not we include a past tense marker, a plural S marker, use of the copula be or the auxiliary be or the auxiliary do, use of prepositions, differences in subject-verb agreement, differences in indefinite and absent articles, a and the, use of multiple negation, leaving out possessive markers. Instead, that possessive marker will be marked with the name of the person. So instead of Mark's car, it would be the car of Mark. And we also see that in lots of other languages, including Spanish. We also see not using that third person singular S. Those are some of those contrastive features. These are different. We don't consider these as an error. These are linguistic differences. Now let's talk about those non-contrastive features. These are the things that should not contrast. These things should not be different across languages. Every language and dialect includes conjunctions, pronouns, demonstratives, locatives, complex sentence types, the double WHs, so who ate what, so two WHs in one sentence, theory of mind, syntax, so specifically answering and asking questions like, why do you think? Because that requires that ability of theory of mind. Also, non-word repetition. This should be able to be done across any language or dialect. So let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, the student says, there are two dogs. Well, in African American English, the plural S, again, is deleted if there's provision of the number that's being referred to. And actually, this actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because the plural, it's already marked. They already told you the number in preceding the noun. So we need to acknowledge that this is a rule-based pattern of language specific to that dialect. Whether it's Southern English, whether it's African American English, whether it's Spanish influenced English, French influenced English, Gullah Geechee influenced English. And we need to respect that as unique to that feature of that language that student has been raised in. So the goal is not to make the student sound like a general American English speaker at all. So we want to make sure that we're not considering these things as being in error or as being disordered. They are simply linguistic differences. Now back to writing. Let's also consider a behavior such as the student has difficulty generating a written passage, but they can tell you about it all day long. Well, we would consider it a linguistic difference if the student may not have mastered all of the L2 just yet, so again, consideration for that stage of language acquisition, or maybe they have mastered it verbally, but they haven't quite gotten it in terms of writing just yet. So again, what you're going to see is improvement with additional instruction and practice. But you might suspect a disability if the difficulty is attending to or remembering what they've previously been taught. Or there may be difficulties with fine motor skills, or there's significant task avoidance for writing. Or again, there's limited or no improvement as you provide additional instruction. In terms of writing, let's talk about spelling. Well, it's likely something related to that student's primary language, the linguistic difference, if the student appears to be, quote unquote, borrowing sounds from their primary language. However, what you're going to see is the more proficient they become with General American English and instruction in those phonemes and what they look like of General American English, you're going to see that improve. You're also going to consider it a linguistic difference if they're writing words that are reflective of English fluency level or even cultural thought patterns, meaning they're going to write more of those words that appear that way. And also words may align to letter sounds or even letter patterns, how sounds can be arranged in certain languages that are more specific to their primary language. And keep in mind that sight words may be spelled phonetically based on their primary language. However, we're going to suspect a disability, or that might be data consider in suspicion of a disability, if the student is making errors such as writing just the correct beginning sound of the word, but then there's random letters after that, again, despite having had that explicit instruction. Same thing with if they might write beginning and ending sounds only, but nothing in the middle. Or they are struggling with that letter formation, and these are not consistent with the differences in letter formation of that primary language, despite instruction. Now let's let's talk about math. Well, the behaviors we might see is the student is manifesting difficulty learning math facts or math operations. And if it's a linguistic difference, that student is lacking that comprehension of the oral instruction, perhaps in General American English, in that L2. But they'll show improvement with visual input, or if you're providing the instruction in the student's primary language. However, we might want to collect some data to suspect a disability if they're having difficulty memorizing those math facts or remembering them from one day to the next, or they require use of manipulatives and devices to complete math problems after significant amounts of practice. Another behavior could be the student has difficulty completing multi-step math computations. Well, a linguistic difference would be the student perhaps is lacking comprehension of that oral instruction in English, as we just spoke about, but they show that improvement with visual input or instruction in their primary language. Suspicion of a disability may look more like the student is forgetting those steps required to complete the problems from one day to the next, and even with that visual input or manipulatives, they're still going to struggle, they'll forget, or even do some number reversals. Another math behavior may be that the student is unable to complete word problems. Now, keep in mind, word problems are language and reading problems. So we're going to need to consider whether or not it's a reading problem, what's causing that primary difficulty. Is it decoding? Or, in the case of a language difference, maybe the student doesn't understand the mathematical terms, the actual vocabulary of more than or less than in General American English, in L2, despite or because they haven't quite mastered that English reading proficiency, again, that stage of language acquisition. But again, they'll show improvement with that instruction either in their primary language or with using visuals. But we might suspect a disability if the student is not understanding how to even begin to process the problem or even identify those key vocabulary words in the math word problem, regardless of if you provide it in the primary language, L1, or in English, L2. In terms of handwriting, the behavior you might see is that the student is unable to copy words correctly. Well, in a language difference, it just may be a lack of experience with writing the English alphabet. If you think about it, some of the languages come with a Cyrillic type of writing. It's not alphabetic, so it looks very different. So unless they've had that explicit instruction, they are going to struggle to master that. But possible indicators of a disability would be that the student demonstrates difficulty copying visual material, and that includes not just letters, but also shapes and other things. So this could be more related to a visual motor or visual memory deficit. Now let's talk about some of the behaviors. So but maybe perhaps the student appears inattentive, or maybe they're easily distracted. Well, in a language difference, you might consider that because they are not yet understanding the English and the instructions and directions in English, because they haven't mastered that level of proficiency yet. Again, looking at that student's stage of language acquisition. But we might consider some concerns and possible disability if the student is inattentive across all environments, even when they can comprehend the language, whether it's L1 or L2. So we may be looking at some of those attention deficits no matter how the directions or instruction are provided, what language they're provided in. What about if the behavior is the student seems unmotivated, or they're angry, or they may manifest some internalizing or externalizing behavior? Well, a student does not understand instruction. It could be again due to the fact that they haven't mastered that level of English, and so maybe they don't feel successful, and so they're less apt to try, or they're less apt to sort of extend themselves out that way. Or the student has anger or low self-esteem because they're just now acquiring that second language acquisition. But we would be more likely to consider a possible disability if that student really is not understanding the instruction, and so now they're becoming frustrated because they don't understand it, whether the information is provided in L1 or L2, and so now we might be suspecting a learning disability. Other behaviors, maybe the student is not turning their homework. Well, we need to think about why that might be. What is the underlying cause? So is it because the student doesn't understand the directions or even how to complete the homework because they haven't gotten to that level of English proficiency yet? Or maybe they don't have access to homework support at home because no one at home speaks English. We would likely consider suspicion of a disability if they seem unable to complete the homework consistently, even if they've been offered time and assistance in order to complete the homework during the school day. So again, now we're looking at, is this maybe a memory or a processing deficit? What about if they're struggling to engage in social interactions with their peers? Well, again, we need to think back to that stage of language acquisition, and maybe that student has not had enough exposure to the various cultural exchanges and how we exchange information in English. However, we might be looking at suspicion of a disability if that student is struggling with social interactions with peers, even after they've been taught what those cultural expectations are for English, and also what those cultural expectations are for English for that age and or those specific settings. So again, we've got to look at whether or not they have been taught what their appropriate social expectations should be for English because of how different cultures can be. So now, based on all of those differences and suspicion of a disability, one thing to think about if we are suspecting a disability, testing if the student has been exposed to and or speaks more than one language. Testing must be provided in both and or all languages, because for those specific concerns or weaknesses or difficulties, for them to be considered as disabled or disordered, you have to see them as disabled or disordered in both or all languages that the student has been exposed to. So for example, if the student is struggling with fluency in English, you would also want to see if they're struggling with their fluency in their primary language. If they're not struggling with stuttering in their primary language, but they are in English, you may likely want to consider if that's due to that code meshing in real time. Let's say the student is struggling to produce the TH sound in English, but that sound is not part of their primary language. That's not a disorder. That's a language difference. It's a difference because that language does not include that phoneme. Okay, what about if the student struggles with sentence formulation in English, but they can form appropriate sentences in their primary language? That's not a disorder. That's a language difference. Students struggling with letter sound correspondence in English, but they know all their letter sounds in their primary language. That's not a disorder. That's instruction. We've got to make sure we're providing that instruction. Same thing with if the student may be struggling with writing in English, but they can write very well in their primary language. That's not a disorder. That's not a disability. So that is why it's so important to make sure that we're testing both and all language. And this also explains why we have to make sure they've been exposed to and what their have a detailed knowledge about what their language exposure is. So for example, how frequently or how often or for how long have they been exposed to English? This is actually what the Language Alberta Environment Questionnaire helps to get at. Now let's consider some academic data that we may need to collect as part of a problem-solving team. Beginning with attendance, there actually is no magic number relative to the number of absences. When we're thinking about attendance or absences, we need to look more comprehensively at the data. So for example, why are the absences occurring? Are there significant medical events that have impacted attendance? How many schools has the student attended? Were the absences sequential, like all at one time? Or maybe were they spaced out throughout the entire year? Also, what efforts have been made to catch that student up with the rest of the class even after they were absent? Were there more absences in K1 and 2 as opposed to third grade and up? Because this may help reveal a lot about the student's development of foundational skills. Were the absences more centered around days before testing or holiday breaks? Also, were absences at the same time every week? So again, in a systematic investigative routine, these are some of the questions that we might want to ask. In terms of academic data, we'd want to know, has the student been retained? What are the student's grades in all the curricular subjects? What's their MAP data? What's the universal screening data? Has the student been identified as at risk based on the universal screening data? And if so, what areas were identified as at risk? And what interventions were provided for those areas identified as at risk? We also want to look at SE Ready and other summative data in terms of, is the student performing significantly below same age peers, same grade level peers, or even peers in the same class? The tool, the Indicator Aligned Inventory, this can provide data about specifically which foundational skills might be missing and which ones should have been provided, which ones should they know. Also, has the student been provided that systematic and explicit instruction in reading, as we've spoken about? And have they been given that additional time, that additional explicit instruction in those linguistic differences, in the phonemes, the graphemes, the morphology, the syntax, the figurative language? So a moment ago, I just mentioned the Indicator Aligned Inventory, and that was the link that was provided on that previous slide. Well, to explain a little bit more about the Indicator Aligned Inventory for word recognition, let me tell you a bit about it. So this is a tool that can be used to look specifically at the skills aligned with the South Carolina ELA standards. So essentially it's based on a nod to the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope. And so what the Indicator Aligned Inventory measures is specific to those foundations of literacy strands in the South Carolina ELA standards. Those are ones that are specific to word recognition. So specifically looking at phonological awareness and phonics, very specifically the alphabetic principle, as well as some of the spelling patterns that include morphology. So some of these specific strands or ELA standards are ELA Foundations 1, ELA Foundations 2, ELA Foundations 3, and ELA Foundations 4. So it's addressing all of those specific skills, when they should have been taught, when they should have been mastered, in order to look at if they should have mastered these skills. As a general overview, the first thing that the Indicator Aligned Inventory looks at is the student's phoneme grapheme correspondences. Now remember, this is really important, especially for multilingual learners, because we want to identify which phoneme grapheme correspondences they might not know, because those phonemes are not in their native language or primary language. So when we start with this is going to save a tremendous amount of time. So just as an example, I was once giving this Indicator Aligned Inventory to a third grade struggling reader. And so what we found, just using this first part of this tool, was the student struggled with long vowels. A third grader struggling with long vowel sounds, what they look like as represented by lines and dots and squiggles, that letter sound correspondence, that phoneme grapheme correspondence. If you're in third grade and you're struggling with long vowels, you're definitely going to be struggling with reading, with decoding. So that is why this is one of the first things to identify. It's because it could be a critical gap in their foundational skill for reading. Now, of course, this slide is very difficult to see, but what I wanted to highlight by sharing a picture of the 2 pages that you're looking at is that there are 2 sets of queries per grade level. So there's expectations, as you see on the left side, and that's for the first semester of kindergarten. And then the other side on the right, that is the queries for the second semester, the end of the second semester for kindergarten. What you see in yellow is specifically that the sets, again, are broken down in terms of those specific indicators in the standards that should have been mastered by the end of the first semester of that grade level. And again, what should have been mastered by the completion of the second semester. And the reason for this is important. The reason this is important is for 2 reasons. One, we don't want to assess students on what they haven't been taught. We don't want to expect them to have mastered something they've never actually been taught. The second reason is because we want to intervene as soon as gaps are identified. So we don't want to wait a whole entire year to go, oh my goodness, they don't know long vowels. Now, in the column in green, you'll see specifically the standard and indicator that the query is looking for. In orange, it lists the specific tools that are necessary for providing those prompts. In purple, those are the actual prompts. In blue is the criteria for mastery. And the criteria for mastery is 100%. Why? Because this is a grade level standard. And so all students are expected to master all grade level standards. Now, the slide does not go on to show you the 2 pages for first grade. It's only showing you kindergarten, but there's also one for second grade because the foundations of literacy strands include kindergarten, first, and second grade. Now, with this information, there's 2 ways to break down the findings. So what we have found is that classroom teachers prefer to break down the findings by grade level. And in looking at grade level, that helps them to better appreciate what are the gaps for the grade level that those teachers are responsible for specifically. So for example, what are the skills that should be expected of a first grader? And so this helps a first grade teacher look at that comprehensively. The other way to break down findings is by standard. So special educators and reading interventionists, we found that they prefer to break them down by standards. Specifically for special education, this helps support the presence of adverse educational impact because you can tie it directly to the standard. Now, when you know exactly what standards are missing and the progression of those standards, then you're able to map out the instruction to get them to grade level proficiency. In other words, there's no guessing about what steps or what skills need to be taught in what sequence. Now let's look at behavior data if this is something that is appropriate to the student that you're working with. In terms of behavior, we want to consider the behavioral data, the observations, and considerations. So we want to, again, it's an investigative routine. We want to ask these questions, such as, what do the observations of the student reveal relative to differences in their social interactions during both educationally related times of day as well as non-educationally related times of day and settings. We also want to consider whether or not, in terms of behavior, the student is breaking behavioral rules or expectations that they don't like, don't agree with, or don't know. Because the underlying cause of why they are violating those behavioral rules or expectations is going to help support the intervention. The other thing to appreciate or ask is, once that student does learn the behavioral expectation, do they continue to break that or violate that expectation? And if they do, why do they continue to violate that behavioral expectation? We also have to make sure that the student has had opportunities to be exposed and to learn the appropriate behavioral expectations for that classroom or even just for the English culture. We've got to make sure we're looking at those underlying reasons for the behavior. Is it due to the language acquisition and they're frustrated or don't understand the language around them? Is it due to transitioning to a new environment or a new country? Is it because of academic challenges and maybe underlying disability? Is it related to mental health or maybe even some other previous diagnosis? Based on this investigative routine and the data that is being collected by the problem-solving team, let's talk about some of the outcomes that could come away from this problem-solving team's investigation. It could be that the data reveals that the student is performing commensurate with their stage of language acquisition and the instruction that's been provided, meaning they're functioning at exactly where they should be in terms of their exposure to English and the instruction that they've received. It could be that intensified interventions in the core instruction, those are needed, especially when we consider that instruction of how of those linguistic differences. It could be that there needs to be some updates made to the ILAP goals or even the accommodations. It could be that interventions are warranted to gather additional information in order to make an informed decision about whether or not the team suspects a disability, meaning they aren't really sure, so we need to gather more information. But it's very important that if interventions or additional data is being gathered, that the team sets a date to reconvene on and review the data. Now, this length of time to reconvene may vary, but it really should not be beyond 6 to 8 weeks. Providing that intervention for 6 to 8 weeks, then meeting back to review. And review not just, quote unquote, are they making progress, but what is the rate of improvement? In other words, looking at, is that intervention helping to close the gap? And then determine those next steps. Or finally, it could be that interventions or other supports are warranted while moving forward with an evaluation because there is suspicion of a disability. Now, one question that is often asked is, when do we determine the student needs an evaluation? And who determines if the student needs to receive an evaluation for a suspected disability? Well, it's very clear in IDEA that all decisions are made by the team, not individual team members. So all decisions need to be made by the team, and it needs to be based on all of that data that we've just discussed. And if moving forward with an evaluation, here's some things to consider prior to that evaluation of a suspected disability. First, we need to consider whether or not the parent handbook to special education, as well as the health and developmental history forms, as well as any other forms, have they been provided in the parent or caregiver's primary or native language? Have they been read or explained to the parent in their native or primary language? Same thing with the permission to evaluate. And also, has the team consulted with the multilingual teacher to determine the language or languages that the evaluation needs to be provided in order to yield the most accurate information about what the student is able to do and what they know academically, developmentally, and functionally, again, thinking back to that specific requirement in IDEA. There also needs to be consideration for whether or not the district evaluators are proficient in the assessment of multilingual learners relative to their knowledge of the cultural differences and what that looks like in terms of the data that is gathered. Again, that's why that top 10 languages has those resources embedded in different links. Also, proficiency with interpreting assessment data, including how that student is represented in a normative sample, if they're adequately represented in a normative sample. Also, proficiency with working with translators. Specifically, very specifically, it is very important that translators are not used to translate an English assessment into another student's language. Why? Because as we've discussed, the languages aren't the same. The phonology is different, the morphology, the syntax, even some of the vocabulary. So we don't want to translate a test that's written for general American English speakers and ask a student who speaks another language to use or know those same skills that aren't part of their language. Because eventually what we would find is that they're quote unquote in error, and they're not. They're just not part of that student's native language. We also need to make sure that the evaluators are providing a variety of assessment tools and strategies, and also especially using dynamic assessment and processing-based assessments, because those have a lot of evidence to support diagnostic accuracy. Now, what happens is if the district does not have evaluators that are proficient in those skills, the district may want to consider contracting with an outside agency who has this expertise until their district employees acquire this appropriate training and expertise. Now, one thing that's very important to say here is nowhere in this slide does it say the evaluator has to be multilingual. Why is that? That's because if you have an evaluator who speaks Spanish, but now we have a student coming in who speaks Russian, that evaluator is no longer multilingual. So instead, what we need is evaluators who have proficiency in all of those different bullet points to find the information about how that language is different. how that student is represented in the normative sample, finding appropriate assessment tools, even if they don't exist for that primary language, and using a variety of assessment tools and strategies to get to that diagnostic accuracy. And finally, let's talk about eligibility as a student with a disability in a multilingual learner. So if or when a student becomes classified as a student with a disability, we're not done yet. We need to make sure that there's a plan for collaboration between the special education teachers, general education teachers, and the multilingual teacher in order to address the variety of needs across all of the different settings and locations that are within that one school building. We need to create a plan to monitor the student with respect to the language acquisition goals that the multilingual teacher is providing, same thing with their accommodations, as well as, or in addition to, the disability-related goals and accommodations as appropriate. So students do not have to be removed. To be very clear, students do not have to be removed and should not be removed from those multilingual supports if or when they become identified as a student with a disability. And that is worth saying again. Students do not have to and actually should not be removed from their multilingual supports if or when they become identified as a student with a disability. And it's also important to consider that oral language foundation in English, being exposed to the oral language foundation in English and appreciating that general education teachers and special education teachers, those are the ones that have the greatest opportunities to accelerate that language comprehension development because that's where they're exposed to the most language during content area instruction. So that is really and truly the heart and the reason for why that collaboration needs to take place. So again, what is the plan for that collaboration? What is the plan for monitoring all of those different things? What is the plan for making all teachers and all related service providers aware of both the ILAP and the content of the ILAP? And then what permissions or processes need to be going on to ensure that special education teachers have that access to the grade level curriculum? Because again, that's the point of specially designed instruction, is to help the student master the same standards that are appropriate for all students. Thank you for your time and your attention and your attendance and your interest in this topic. And thank you for what you do for children every day. If you'd like more information, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you. Bye-bye.